In the long and storied history of Netheril, no single individual towers above the rest quite like Ioulaum. Karsa's is more famous, certainly. The man who killed an empire is always remembered more vividly than the man who built it. But it was Ioulaum who created the foundations upon which the entire edifice of Netherese civilization rested. It was Ioulaum who solved the fundamental problem that limited every arcanist who had ever lived. And it was Ioulaum who first looked up at the empty sky and saw not emptiness, but a place where cities might float. He was born in the year negative 3315 of the Dala Reckoning, during the height of the Nether Age when the scroll's knowledge was still fresh, and the possibilities of magic seemed truly infinite. Even as a child, Ioulaum displayed an aptitude for the art that marked him as something extraordinary. The stories say he could work cantrips before he could walk, that he deduced the principles of second circle magic by observing the enchantments woven into his mother's household tools, that his first original spell, crafted at an age when most children were still learning to read, was a minor conjuration so elegant that his instructors mistook it for the work of a master. These stories may be embellished. The Netherese were never shy about aggrandizing their heroes, but the core truth is undeniable. Ioulaum was a prodigy of the First Order, and from his earliest years, every arcanist who encountered him recognized that this was a mind that would reshape the world. His early career was defined by war. In the first 2 centuries of his life, for Ioulaum, like many powerful arcanists, extended his natural lifespan far beyond the normal human span through magical means. He led the defense of Netheril against a massive orc horde that poured down from the plain of standing stones. This was no minor border skirmish. The horde numbered in the tens of thousands, a howling tide of green-skinned brutality that threatened to overwhelm the nation's defenses. Ioulaum organized the magical defense, coordinating thousands of spellcasters and warriors in a campaign that lasted years. The climactic battle, fought in the passes of the rampart peaks, saw 18,000 orcs left dead on the field, 10,000 of whom were slain by magic alone. The orcs retreated, broken, and Netheril was secured. But Ioulaum was not a warrior by nature. He was a builder, a creator, an inventor whose mind was always racing ahead of the present, sketching blueprints for a future that others could not yet imagine. And the problem that consumed him, the problem he turned to with the full force of his genius once the orc wars were behind him, was the fundamental limitation of the weave. The weave was the source of all arcane magic. It was the invisible fabric of raw magical energy that the goddess Mistral had woven through reality, and every spell that an arcanist cast was, in essence, a carefully shaped distortion of this fabric. The weave was immensely powerful and nearly inexhaustible, but accessing it came at a cost. Every time an arcanist drew upon the weave to power a spell, a portion of their own life force was consumed. This toll was small for minor magics. A cantrip might shave a few hours from a caster's natural lifespan, but it accumulated with more powerful workings. The creation of a major magical item might cost an arcanist months or years of life. The most powerful spells demanded the most from their casters, and even Ioulaum himself, with all his genius and all his power, was still a mortal being with a finite supply of vitality. This limitation had defined the practice of magic since the art was first discovered. The elves, with their centuries-long lifespans, could afford to be generous with their vitality. They had years to spare. Humans did not. And so, even with the Nether Scrolls providing knowledge that surpassed anything the elves possessed, human arcanists were still constrained by the fragility of their own bodies. They could know how to cast the most powerful spells imaginable. They simply could not afford to. Ioulaum's solution was the Mythallar. The Mythallar was a crystalline sphere, roughly 5 feet in diameter, that could draw raw magical energy directly from the weave and channel it into an area of effect around itself. Within this area, which extended for several miles in all directions, the ambient magical energy was so dense, so concentrated, that it could power magical devices without requiring any expenditure of a caster's personal vitality. Items placed within a Mythallar's field of influence would function as though they were being constantly supplied with magical energy from an external source. They did not need to be individually enchanted. They did not need to draw upon the life force of their creator. They simply worked, powered by the endless, inexhaustible flow of energy from the weave itself. The implications were staggering. With the Mythallar, Ioulaum had essentially created a magical power grid. A single Mythallar could provide enough energy to power an entire city's worth of magical devices. Lights that never dimmed, fountains that never ran dry, tools that never wore out, heating and cooling systems that maintained perfect comfort in every season. And because the energy came directly from the weave, rather than from the arcanists themselves, there was no personal cost, no drain on vitality, no shortened lifespans. The arcanists could create as many magical devices as they wished, and the Mythallar would power them all. But there was a catch. These quasi-magical items, as they came to be called, only functioned within the field of influence of a Mythallar. Remove them from that field, and they became inert, dead weight, ordinary objects with no more magic in them than a common stone. This meant that the most magical society in the world was also, in a sense, the most geographically tethered. You could not take the wonders of Netheril with you when you traveled beyond the reach of a Mythallar. The magic stayed home. This limitation would have been a minor inconvenience if the Mythallars had remained stationary. But Ioulaum, as always, was thinking bigger. In the year negative 2954 of the Dala Reckoning, Ioulaum accomplished something that had never been done before, and that, in the minds of most rational beings, should not have been possible. Using a spell called Proctiv's Move Mountain, a working of such enormous power that it strained the weave itself, he carved the peak off a mountain, inverted it, and attached a Mythallar to the flat underside. Then, using the Mythallar's connection to the weave to sustain the enchantment, he lifted the entire mass of rock into the sky. It floated. The first flying enclave of Netheril rose above the forests and the rivers and the villages below. A colossal inverted peak of stone hanging impossibly in the air, its Mythallar glowing faintly at its base like a second sun. Upon its broad, flat upper surface, the former mountain peak, now a plateau suspended miles above the earth. Ioulaum built the city. He called it Xinlenal, and it was the wonder of the age. Imagine what it must have been like for the people below, the fishermen on the narrow sea, the farmers in the river valleys, the children playing in the dirt streets of villages that had not changed in centuries, to look up one morning and see a mountain floating above them, a mountain with buildings on it, a mountain with lights and gardens and the distant tiny figures of people walking along its edges, looking down at the world they had left behind. The psychological impact alone must have been overwhelming. This was not an incremental improvement. This was not the next logical step in a gradual progression. This was a rupture in the fabric of what was considered possible. The Netherese had broken the contract between humanity and gravity, and the world would never look the same again. Xinlenal changed everything. Every arcanist of sufficient power immediately wanted their own flying city. It became the ultimate status symbol, the ultimate expression of magical mastery. To carve a mountain from the earth, invert it, affix a Mythallar, and raise it into the sky. The process was extraordinarily difficult and demanding, requiring magical resources that only the most powerful arcanists could muster. But the incentive was irresistible. To rule a flying city was to be, for all practical purposes, a king. The arcanist who created and maintained an enclave held absolute power within it. The laws were his laws. The resources were his resources. The common people who lived upon the enclave existed there at his pleasure and served at his command. The enclaves multiplied. By the year negative 2811 in the Dala reckoning, less than a century and a half after Xinlenal took flight, 13 flying cities rode the air currents above Netheril. By negative 2207, the beginning of what the historians call the Golden Age, one new enclave was being raised every single year. The sky above Netheril became crowded with them, massive inverted peaks of stone, each one a self-contained city-state, each one orbiting slowly above the landscape in patterns determined by the whims of its ruling arcanist. Some flew high, miles above the earth, where the air was thin and cold and the stars seemed close enough to touch. Others flew low, skimming the treetops, their shadows passing over villages and farmlands like the shadows of clouds. Some were vast, home to tens of thousands of people. Others were small, private retreats for arcanists who preferred solitude to society. And upon each one, the quasi-magical items powered by the central Mythallar transformed daily life into something that would have seemed like paradise to the ground-dwelling humans of Low Netheril. Magical lights illuminated every street and chamber, banishing darkness completely. Magical fountains provided clean water, heated or cooled to any desired temperature. Magical lifts carried people between levels of the cities without the need for stairs. Magical heating kept the interiors warm, even at altitudes where the natural temperature was well below freezing. Food was preserved indefinitely by magical cold storage. Clothing cleaned itself. Injuries healed faster in the magically saturated environment. Even the air was enchanted, filtered, freshened, perfumed with whatever scent the ruling arcanist preferred. But the most important quasi-magical items were also the most mundane. The household tools and everyday objects that made life on the enclaves comfortable and convenient for ordinary citizens. Brooms that swept floors on their own, cooking pots that stirred themselves, looms that wove cloth without human hands, quills that wrote at dictation. These were not grand dramatic magics, they were small, practical domestic magics, the same kind of cantrips that the common people of Netheril had always known, but amplified and sustained by the Mythallar's endless power. And they transformed the economy of the enclaves. With so much manual labor automated, the citizens of High Netheril had unprecedented amounts of leisure time. They turned to art, to music, to philosophy, to the creation of flying sculptures made from precious metals that wheeled and danced in the thin mountain air. They built strange, beautiful buildings that defied the conventions of ground-level architecture. Towers that spiraled in impossible curves. Bridges that arched across chasms of empty air. Gardens that grew on vertical surfaces, their plants held in place by nothing but magic. It was magnificent. It was intoxicating. And it was, in hindsight, the beginning of the end. For the flying cities created a division in Netherese society that had not existed before. The arcanists and their favored followers lived above. Everyone else lived below. High Netheril and Low Netheril, the haves and the have-nots, the masters of the sky and the servants of the earth. And as the centuries passed and the enclaves multiplied, that division deepened and hardened into something that resembled, more and more closely, a caste system. The citizens of High Netheril looked down upon the common folk of Low Netheril, looked down on them literally. from the edges of their floating plateaus, with a condescension that curdled, over time, into contempt. And the people of Low Netheril looked up at the impossible cities overhead and felt something that was part awe, part resentment, and part a slow-burning anger that would never find an outlet. Ioulaum had meant the Mythallar to be a gift to all of Netheril. He had meant the flying cities to be a triumph of human achievement, a monument to what the Netherese could accomplish when they put aside the limitations of flesh and gravity and reached for something greater. And in many ways they were. But they were also a monument to a truth that the Netherese, for all their intelligence, for all their magical sophistication, never quite grasped. Power, even magical power, flows upward. It concentrates. It accumulates in the hands of those who already have the most of it, and it leaves those at the bottom with less than they had before. The Mythallar was the greatest invention in the history of Netheril. It was also the instrument that divided the nation in two and planted the seeds of an inequality that would fester for millennia. But those were concerns for the future. In the present, the sky was full of cities and magic was everywhere, and the Netherese, high and low alike, looked upon their creation and called it good.